All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. And folks, I'm very excited to be dialed into our nation's capital. We're going to talk to an industry visionary today. We've got Mr. Chris Mohr on the line from the Software and Information Industry Association, or SIIA. We're going to talk all about data and the data life cycle and protecting the data life cycle and frankly being responsible stewards of data. And that's good for lots of different reasons, one of which happens to be this explosion of artificial intelligence. So it's not just people using data and people processing data. No, there are machines that are using data to train on and to do all sorts of different things. And that is very, very disruptive. And I think it's going to continue to be disruptive. So we want to talk also about responsible AI and how to get there. And the short answer is a lot of it has to do with data. And with that, let me welcome Chris Mohr to the show. Thanks for your time today. Tell us a bit about yourself and about the SIIA.
Sure, my pleasure. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the invite.
Yeah,
Uh,
you bet.
we are what we like to say is we're a place for folks who are in the business of information. And what we do is we look to preserve and protect a healthy information life cycle. In other words, we want to make sure that there is a good environment for its creation, dissemination, and productive use. And
Hmm.
our members range from uh, platform companies that you're probably familiar with, as well as educational publishers, uh, news organizations, and database publishers, and financial data firms.
Okay, and you get into a lot of different policy areas, obviously. I mean, there's intellectual property, there's privacy, there's cybersecurity, and just the use of data. So when you talk about the data life cycle, I presume you're talking about data from its creation to its grave, basically, from its
That's right.
inception through its use all the way to its deprecation, which in many cases doesn't even happen because it just sits around forever. But in a lot of cases, companies will follow process and procedure, and after X period of years, whatever the regulation is, they will delete that data and move on. Can you talk about how that works? I mean, you are an association, so you have leaders from many of these big companies, I guess over 800 members, who come together to forums and really talk about this stuff and kind of hash out what to do. Because I know from experience, policy is hard, and policies need to be understandable, they need to be known, and they need to be reasonable in order for people to follow them. So tell us a bit about how you go about doing that and maybe give us some examples.
Sure. I mean, I think there there are areas, for example, where there's a pretty good bit of consensus within our membership, which is the easiest place
Right.
to take policy
Right.
positions. Um, and so, for example, let's talk about privacy. That's right. That's a hot topic. And is there an AI wrinkle? Absolutely, there is. Uh, but that's an area where we saw a bunch of, we saw state laws coming from California in their in their signature law, and we looked at the text and we saw, okay, there's a looking at it from the standpoint of a United States model, which it was likely to be initially. Um, this has a real First Amendment problem. And the way that Europe approached GDPR and the way that we as the United States approach the use of information are very, very different.
Hmm.
And so there we looked at that and we said, look, we want there to be a privacy law. We're not opposing the idea that you pass a privacy law, but you need to carve out publicly available information because if you don't, the whole thing will go down in flames,
Right.
right? And so we successfully, on behalf of our members, and they were, uniformly, I think, behind this, advocated for language in that first in the CCPA and then in the ballot initiative that carves out the use of publicly available data. So you can't tell for somebody who publishes for example, a database of news articles to stop selling
Right.
information about you or to delete information about you, which under GDPR is, theoretically can happen. And certainly in the business to business publishing space, which is another um, division of ours, that kind of thing is really important.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I remember when GDPR came out and they had this whole thing. I think you might like this. They had this whole thing about the right to be forgotten,
Mm-hmm.
which is where they're saying that if you're an EU citizen and you want some corporation to delete whatever data it has about you, that you have a right to do that, and the corporation has to follow through and go ahead and delete your data. Well, as soon as I heard that, I was like, good luck with that one. First of all, data about someone in a company gets lots of places. It could be in this database, it could be in that database, it could be in email exchanges between people. There are lots of places where that data can live. And quite frankly, in many organizations, there aren't too many people who know all the places where that data can live. And it's hard to query your entire information landscape. I mean, these days, just this morning, I did a call with Justin Borgman, who's the CEO and co founder of a company called Starburst. And they do federated queries, like on a data lake, basically, where they can query all sorts of different systems, all sorts of different databases through one abstraction layer. And that's very cool. And it's also very new, right? So, and not every company has Starburst or Dremio or these kind of tools. So, point being, it puts a tremendous onus on the organizations to be able to do all that. Besides which, it's very difficult to know, is this the John Brown who lives at 101 Main Street or the John Brown who lives at 401 First Street or something? Like, just knowing identity resolution is a challenge in and of itself. So, my point is, GDPR, pretty onerous stuff. I mean, I understand it's not always prosecuted. So the idea is to have these sort of goals to strive toward. But there's something else I want to throw out and maybe just get your take on all this stuff. I came up with this concept. I call it the right to be respected. And what that means is I want anyone who's using my data to respect my data and to respect my preferences. So if you ask me how do I want to be contacted, I say by email, not by phone. I would like for your operational system to reflect that and for people to not call me and instead to email me, right? That requires an architecture with policies that are baked in and adhered to. But I think that's a more reasonable approach is to say to the XYZ organizations, yes, of course, you need my data when I buy things or if I sign up for stuff. That's all fine. But just, be a careful and responsible steward of our information and have some policy around that that makes sense. But what do you think about all that?
I mean, I to me that sounds very sensible. And I think the question that where it becomes sticky, I think, is depending on who you talk to, the idea, the word respected carries a lot of weight,
Right.
right? That does a lot of work.
Right.
And so, for some people, respecting data meant, the second that I have finished conducting business with your organization, I want you to take all my data, put it on a hard drive, smash it into bits, and throw it in the sea. So
Right.
I know that it's gone.
Right.
That's probably not terribly practical,
Right.
right? And other folks may say, "Not that's not this generally not how our well, not generally, it's not how our members roll," but they won't say, "Well, we respected you enough to get the data from you by consent in the first place.
Right.
We done, are we done here?" I
Right.
mean, that's not
Absolutely.
yeah, that's not that's not practical either. And it's look, nobody wants to get spammed with tons of messages from a company that they just did business with once, or God forbid, called.
Right.
Um, and I think there are some natural market checks on that stuff.
And
Uh,
that's an excellent point, right? Is that the companies that do respect your privacy, that do respect your data and you as a person, well, they're going to have a good brand. They're going to have a good reputation. And that's where you let the market guide things. But to your point, you do need some kind of policy. And I think the good news is that the technologies we have today enable robust policy management. 10 years ago or 20 years ago, all you could really do is govern access at the database level or at the application layer, for example, through a login or something like that. But now you really can't have policies that are baked into cloud based systems that are usually role based. If this person is an accountant, they have access to accounting data. If they're a senior executive, they access to a lot of different data. All those kind of things are possible today. And that makes the process of policy design and implementation and enforcement a whole heck of a lot easier, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, and that's something even as a small organization, we have where there are people who need to have the keys to everything,
Right.
but there ain't many of them,
Right.
right?
That's
Um,
right.
and there are folks who need to be able to access Microsoft Office, and that's essentially about it.
Right.
And it's really important internally. I think technology's come a long way to allowing internal companies to exercise those controls, as well as, I mean, in terms of what our members do, they even when they're dealing with customers, there will be a range of controls on what a particular customer might be able to do with what they access, and how that's determined. So that could be everything from reps and warranties in a contract, in a terms of use, uh, in the subscription agreement, to IP monitoring and clearance, to sometimes even site visits
Hmm.
to be sure that this place that is licensing access to information is, in fact exists
Right.
and is not some, it depends. They adopt a risk-based approach to all of this stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And you make another good point about having the need for people who understand how the systems work, right? If something is a black box, well, it's kind of hard to understand a black box. And now, I mean, at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, artificial intelligence, large language models, right? These companies that built some of the first ones, like OpenAI, for example. I know a lot of people who know about that whole process, and what I'm told is that early in the game, they realize they cannot just set these engines loose on the internet at large because there's a lot of nonsense on the internet. There's a lot of true stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that's not true. There's speculation. There's sarcasm. There are all kind of things, and so they had to be very careful about how they train the models. But they clearly train the models on a corpus of data on the internet. And so, like, where do you run into? How do you even delineate copyright on something like that? And what's fun is if you ever ask ChatGPT or Gemini, which is what I use, about copyright, it'll give you a pretty thoughtful answer. It'll say, well, actually, you might want to talk to your attorney or something like that. But what are your high level thoughts about that? I realize it's a very sensitive subject, but I'm sure you guys are talking about that, right?
We do, and this is an area I had mentioned. There are areas where our members agree, and this is an area where they don't. But
Interesting.
there are a few points, and I'm a recovering copyright lawyer, and so perfectly happy to have a relapse. But just so you know,
you've,
uh,
you've been there.
I've been there. So there are uh, there are definitely two sides to this story, and the on the one side, you have a technology that, at its core, is looking for statistical relationships between words and series of words,
Right.
basically,
Right.
right? That's what it's interested in.
Right.
So a word, quick brown, the next likely word is fox, is a lot more likely than rutabaga, and it's a physics model of sorts
Right.
for language.
Right.
And so in determining those relationships, you are abstracting out a particular non-fact, if you like. And the argument on the one side would point to reverse engineering cases that have held that type of activity to be lawful.
Right.
That's that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that, on the one hand, the work may be copied. The work was copied. There's no doubt about that. It is being used to create works that may not be literally similar, but are nonetheless competitively substitutive for the works of the original originating authors.
Right.
That's an issue. And there may be issues, there may be other issues in there around the weights assigned to particular kinds of content. There may be issues around whether or not any of the content was piratical. There may be issues around any number of things. But the thing is that these are issues that are uniquely poorly situated to have a legislature deal with them because they're fact specific. And that's how the courts resolve these things one case at a time,
Oh,
which
interesting.
is, and that's where our members are. So even though they disagree about these things and they think in some circumstances the law ought to play, one group will say, well, in this circumstance, the law ought to apply in a particular way versus a different circumstance. That kind of salami slicing is what needs to happen before there can really be any policy solution.
Right, that's very interesting. So, for example, I remember, well, I guess in Canada, they just had passed this law, and in California, I think they're doing something similar where the government is saying that if you link to a bunch of news articles from media companies, you have to pay those people based on the clicks and things of this nature. And so, what's the law of unintended consequences doing here? It's saying, well, fine, then we just won't do that. So we won't disseminate the news anymore. We won't disseminate this information, and it kind of gets sticky very, very quickly, and you start asking yourself, all right, does this make sense? And like, how would you compensate people for these things? Would you have to open the kimono and show what you paid as an organization to the author? I mean, wow, that conversation gets goes sideways pretty quickly. And I remember news aggregation sites, for example, where you just have a bunch of links to other articles. They're saying, oh, now you'd have to pay those people. This has come and gone a few times. We've got our first break coming up here in just a second, but we'll
Mm-hmm.
pick this up after the break. It is a bit of a stifling question to wonder, well, hyperlinks are what the internet is all about. Like at the very core, it's just links to other stuff that you can then explore and learn about and have discovery and do all these kinds of educational things. So if you start trying to track that, well, how would you even do that? I mean, there's no one standard for being able to report on that. Does everyone have to download a certain kind of software to do that? I mean, it goes sideways so quickly. And I don't think that many people really understand that a lot of these aspirations are either untenable or going to have unintended consequences that are just so dire. It really undercuts the whole mission in the first place of trying to protect the authors of some particular piece of content somewhere. It gets wild and woolly real fast. But folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back with Chris Mohr, and you're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things information life cycle, responsible information management. We're talking to Chris Mohr of the Software and Industry Information and Industry Association, right? Did I get that right?
Close
Yes,
enough.
Software
It
and
doesn't really
Information
roll off the tongue, does it? I got to
Industry.
work on
So it's SIIA, dialing in from our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And you mentioned in the last segment piratical, meaning pirated. And so
that.
if someone has trained their model on pirated software, pirated movies, for example, that's a whole separate area that needs to be handled differently from a policy perspective, right? Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm talking about when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is in the context of a copyright lawsuit, which is where all this is now. There is uh, there's a defense called fair use, which is
Hmm.
kind of copyrights, if you like, copyrights golden rule. It's not do unto others and run. It's it's do unto others as you would have them do
Right.
do to you. And it's designed to be a
Defensive.
rule of reason, right?
Right.
And so, but it's one that's based in equity or fairness. And so your risk looks different if you had lawfully acquired a bunch of stuff, a bunch of legitimate copies, if you legitimately got access to legitimate copies and used them versus you got access to illegitimate copies, infringing copies, and use those, the fairness balance looks different. It's the risk analysis is simply different. And that's saying it without opining on how the case may turn out,
Right.
because there's lots of other facts that could swing it one way or the other, but the risk looks different.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. And so what we're trying to do is define reasonable policies. And I know all about fair use. It basically says, look, I mean, you can read something and remember it. And then if you happen to quote it and you didn't realize you're quoting it verbatim, well, you're not doing something bad. You're just reflecting back. And then what's interesting is that's really kind of what these AI models are doing, the large language models. The big aha moment for me was understanding that when you train one of these models on information, it's not actually persisting the verbatim text. Rather, it is adjusting, the engine adjusts its own weights and biases in its parameters, which is kind of like how humans learn. I mean, these are neural nets that were designed to attempt to reflect how human beings behave. But the point is, it's not like copying and then pasting later on. It's absorbing this information, adjusting its parameters accordingly. And there are billions of parameters in some of these models. And then it's reflecting back to you text based upon your prompt. And it's a predictive engine. Basically, it's a predictive engine that gives you what it thinks you're looking for based upon your prompt, which is a very different thing from just copying text and then pasting it under a different name, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, the I had a similar insight for me was that these engines are essentially a particular kind of artist, which I wouldn't describe on a family show. And what they what I mean by that is they say, you know, act as if you were.
Hmm.
So if you ask them a question and say, I would like the answer to this, to a particular question, can you explain the fair use defense to me? You are saying, act as if you are an expert on fair use. What would you tell this person?
Right.
And then the quality of the data will determine that answer, right? It could
Interesting.
be right, it could be wrong. And when you get into more sensitive questions around security, um, around, for example, I don't know, creating chemical weapons and stuff like that, it requires a lot of thought and care to make sure that the engine um, doesn't do what it's supposed to, so to speak.
Right. Well, and of course, there's dual use technologies. That's a very
Mhm.
common thing to
Sure.
watch out for in the government because you can use the stuff for fertilizer or to make a bomb, right?
Right.
And so you have to be able to understand the difference between the two. And you're right that this comes into question where rubber meets road when there's a lawsuit somewhere, and then you have to hash out all the different issues and try to understand. But I think you're on target to say that the fair use doctrine is meant to be fair, as the name would indicate. It's meant to say, all right, there are lines we can draw about how you can responsibly use these things. And as I understand it, in the music industry, there's some pretty precise rules around that, like how many notes in a row can be the same and things of this nature when push comes to shove in a court of law somewhere. But just generally speaking, it's very interesting to me to see how these large language models have triggered all these conversations around ethics and ethical AI and what you can
Mhm.
do. And I think the answer to most of that is solved in two different ways. One is data governance, and the other is transparency. And the transparency argument, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that because, of course, you got Llama 2 and Llama 3 from Meta, which are open source. OpenAI used to be open source. It's not now. It's now a black box. And what do you think, from your perspective, how big a difference is that? How does that change things when it's a black box versus an open source model?
So that is, I'm going to give you an answer that's accurate and both technically accurate and practically useless.
Right.
And the answer is that it depends.
Right.
I think, because we have seen these debates before. And by that, I mean, there was a time when those who made, and I'll put it in scare quotes, black box software were
Right.
scared to death of open source,
Right.
viewed it as a virus, one that needed, a proportionate response,
Right.
right?
Right.
And it turned out to be a really good way of developing secure and interoperable systems in certain circumstances. There are times when you will want that. There are times when you won't. Um, I think here we are seeing to some degree a similar kind of
Right.
we're seeing a similar drama play out. I think it is a little different around the edges, but there it really has to go there. The way that it's different is that the engines themselves are so flexible.
Hmm.
And so there, in other
Interesting.
words, if you're building, I don't know, an open source video rendering tool, just looking at this screen, that's what it is. Whereas an open source AI model is different. So what is the right approach to that? The right approach to dealing with something like that is going to be based on risk. In other words, you have to be sure that as, and this is the way that the US is progressing, this is the way the White House has made clear that it wants to go. They want a risk-based approach to this.
Hmm.
But to give you a really simple answer, and in our experience, I mean, we've been around for, going on, we're creeping on 50,
Wow.
which is a long time for a quote technology close quote association.
Right.
So we've seen a few rodeos, um, and in our experience anyway, technology neutral regulation tends to be the best way to approach these things. In other words, you don't look
Hmm.
so much, you look at the risks that the technology creates. So
Hmm.
fraud is still going to be fraud. It doesn't matter if it's a scammer calling you in real life, or if it's a bot scammer using AI to create a voice. They're both okay. Both of those things are scary. They are both. It's a dual use technology, right? People they will use it in movies, for example,
Hmm.
to create a character that no longer exists, or an actor's voice that can no longer use his.
Right.
Right? That's dual use technology, but it's still fraud.
Right.
And there are remedies for that. And if there are technology specific angles, that's what we need to look into, as opposed to saying, okay, and this is typical of the EU, sort of where they started was it's not coming out unless we approve it.
Right.
And that's which treats, your Spotify algorithm the same way that it would treat power grid management.
Hmm.
That's just not that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of something too, because deep fakes are definitely an issue. Certainly, we're going to see this in the political sphere. I mean,
Hmm.
I've seen a couple that were very funny. I'm not going to lie. I won't say which one it was or who it was, but it was like, what? What did she say? I had
Hmm.
to laugh, but okay, it's a deep fake. That's what's happening here. But I think that probably, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, there are some very practical ways you can leverage technology to know if something is genuine because most cameras are digital cameras these days and they have a whole host of metadata that's baked into that device about what device it is, what time this thing was taken, what the location was. A lot of them have geolocation. So if you pass all those markers, then that looks good. Then you could say this photograph was of the wreckage from a tornado in Kansas and it checks out. Yep, it was in Kansas. Yep, it was this date. Okay, that looks pretty good. And you're starting to see, I think it was Meta and someone else say, maybe it was Google, they're going to try to create some watermarks on digitally altered photography, videos, things of this nature. Also, I think that's a very practical way to go because then you'll be able to sense that or your browser can sense that and it'll say and you can turn it on or off like is this real or is this generated? I think that's some pretty good stuff. Even when someone calls you on the phone, is it a real voice? I mean, I get calls and I know the technology underneath, so I'm curious to see and like they'll wait a second. Oh, how are you doing? Anyway, this is Jane from such and such. Blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, sure it is. Like this is the computer voice talking to you. But what do you think about all that about the practical ways we can leverage technology and existing formats and protocols to kind of shepherd ourselves towards getting to the truth?
So there's one of the ideas. Um, I tend to be optimistic about the role of technology in this space. In other words, we will deploy things, and then there will always be some kind of unintended consequence,
Right.
right? One way or another. And then we figure out a way to fix it. So in this particular space, content provenance, what you were talking about, is that's exactly that's exactly the kind of thing that can
Right.
greatly ameliorate the harm from deepfakes, because you'll know where the image came from and whether
That's
or
right.
not it was altered.
That's right.
That's that kind of thing. It takes time. Standards doesn't take long to lie,
That's a
right?
good quote.
Um, but it does take time to develop standards for figuring out what the truth is, particularly when you have a variety of companies with a variety of different kinds of IP getting together and trying to figure out something that's going to work for everybody. That's how the standards process works, and it's an incredibly valuable one, but it takes time,
Right.
right? And we've seen the same kinds of things happen in all kinds of areas. Content moderation. I know it's a what they call a fraught topic,
Right.
right? But those algorithms get a lot of bad stuff down.
Hmm.
They get a lot, and yes, are people doing bad things? Yes. Are they doing bad things on the internet? For sure. And it takes and it doesn't take the scale is so the numbers are just so big that even a small failure rate is an enormous amount of
Right.
available bad stuff.
Right. That's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
and it's hard to it's hard to persuade people that uh, they're people are trying really hard when the numbers are so big.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like from the old days, proving your value as a counsel through all of the bad things that didn't happen.
Yeah. That's funny, right? Like you can't prove a negative, right?
Exactly.
The age old argument.
Right. Or if they did, things would get really, really bad
Right. Well, there you go with
in a
again
hurry.
the law of unintended consequences, and boy, can it come just screeching down the pike if you throw down some mantra or some dictate about what can and cannot be done. Again, I get to what I call the black market effect. When rules and regulations are unreasonable and significantly unreasonable, you can rest assured that people are going to go around them. They're going to find other ways to do it. They're going to offshore it. They're going to get deputies to do it. They're going to pay people other ways to have them do it. I mean, there's just like a thousand things you can do, and getting to the bottom of it is a very difficult thing. I had a guy on this show a long, long time ago, I think in 2009, a guy, I'll never forget his name, Chuck Nice from the Insurance Institutes of America. And he had this great quote. He said, let me tell you, if an insurance company wants to hide something, you're not going to find it. And I was like, wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. He had a great quote too, because we were talking about could better governance have prevented the housing crash in 2008, or the market crash, basically the money markets that went down and all that stuff. And he said, "Yeah, I don't think so." He goes, "Like, who would have known that lending money to people who couldn't afford it was a bad idea?" So you get back to that practicality argument, right? I mean, you can talk all day about theories and policies and all these kinds of things, but at the end of the day, it has to be reasonable. It has to make sense. Well, folks, second segment is up here. Stand by. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to Chris Mohr with the Software and Information Industry Association, or SIIA. And Chris, here's a topic that I'm dying to learn about: data brokers. There's so much data being bought and sold. There are all these contracts out there. A lot of good stuff is happening. A lot of people have no idea that this is happening or what's going on with it. But give me your take on data brokers and what the policymakers are trying to achieve in that whole world.
So I think, well, what they're trying to achieve, I think, is the question is not what they're trying to achieve because we share those goals. Is really a question of method. And they're very much at times it feels like they're very much at the world peace stage of thinking. Um, the the
World peace stage of thing.
the
That's great.
the problem we have is that the way they typically define data broker is that a data broker is somebody that publishes personal information about someone else with whom they don't have a direct relationship.
Hmm.
That is incredibly broad. And it is our point of view is if you look at that's also a kind of if you think you can just come in and regulate that, that's kind of a European way of looking at it. In other words, that this information is the property of the person who you're talking about.
Hmm.
That if you look at things that way, then the data broker regime makes sense. Um, The problem with that is if you are talking about an entity that collects information about other people with whom they don't have a direct relationship, what you're talking about is regulating the activity of commercial publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that has, and you can do that, but you have to look at it through a different lens. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why it doesn't make sense to think of personal information as property.
Hmm.
But, and I'll give you a couple. So the first reason is we have a First Amendment. So there is one tranche of information that you can't regulate at all, right? And that's stuff generally that's in the public domain,
Right.
newsworthy public information, information that the government voluntarily releases that you're free to discuss and comment on, even if it's about people, especially if it's about people. You don't get to yank that back out and say, as a regulator, no, you can't discuss this anymore.
Right.
So that's one piece. So that's not property at all. That belongs to everybody. So that's one piece. The second piece is information that the government could regulate, uh, but it needs a reason. So, in other words, because the first would get something called strict scrutiny, which is the test that if you're the government side on the government side of the V, you never want to see because you always lose,
Right.
right? The that's shorthanding centuries of constitutional law.
Right.
Um, the the middle piece is information that the government probably could regulate if it does so in a thoughtful and measured way. And plus, there may be policy reasons why you want that information to circulate,
Right.
right? So, for example, financial information about individuals, you would want in certain circumstances to have people be able to access that information. For example, for looking at politically exposed persons or for money laundering purposes, you want to be able to exchange that kind of information,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things, or for credit, right? You could regulate that information. You just have to do so in a reasonable way. That's fine. And there's lots of stuff there's lots of stuff that falls in that bucket where if it's done in a measured way that the government can regulate the potential for misuse because they're going to look at the risk from that and decide, okay, no, you can't use it for this. And then
Interesting.
there's a third tranche that's really easy to regulate where the where the harm is so obvious and intuitive from the use of that information that it follows the way night follows day. So, for
Mm.
example, unauthorized distribution of passwords or account numbers or full
Right.
SSNs, et cetera. Like that type of stuff that has yes, there are no ideas there. Really, it's a key of some kind, as an example.
I see.
But
Good
it's
point.
more functional than anything else.
Right.
That kind of stuff is easy. And a commercial publisher of that type of information is probably not serving a wildly useful purpose,
That's right.
right?
They're probably bad guys.
They're probably bad guys, but there are people who maybe um, who are who may be who may be selling geolocation data or other kinds of data that have a lot of really valuable purposes that you would want to allow to continue.
Mm-hmm.
And that is true both on the private sector side. It's also true on the government side, where the availability of this kind of information is a legitimate concern, but it becomes a proxy war for law enforcement priorities.
Hmm.
So, in other words, rather than saying, okay, you are using certain kinds of information to track down folks who have overstayed their legal welcome in the country, or if you're using it to track down pregnant women, therefore we ought to ban all law enforcement use of that information,
Right.
right? Do you really want that?
Right.
Right? I mean, do you really not want to be able to get access to the cartel operative's cell phone? Is that the end result here?
Right.
Right? I mean, that is a completely legitimate discussion.
Right.
Uh,
These are
but
the
the government,
cliffs. These are the cliffs they talk about, right? From a legal perspective, you can go off the cliff this way, you can go off the cliff that way. You don't want to go off either cliff. You want to stay somewhere in the middle.
somewhere in the middle, but that, it's a very charged environment around both of these things, because there is no doubt there are people doing bad things with data. There's no doubt about that, right? I mean, there are people selling this to people that they shouldn't sell it to. I mean, our members don't do this, that kind of thing. That's why
Right.
they take know your customer type steps,
Right.
right? That's different. That's kind of part of the responsible action.
Yeah.
But we view it as, again, if you view it through a publishing lens, you it makes to me it makes more sense. It's in a sense easier to regulate because you're focusing on specific risks, and then you drill down on those risks, and you don't have to worry so much about the First Amendment because you're going to
Interesting.
be narrower and more focused by definition.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think of it as property that's being used willy-nilly, it's almost impossible. You're guaranteed your chance of unintended consequences is it's almost guaranteed.
Yeah, wow. That's excellent. Well, we got time for one more thread. I think the
Okay.
segment's ending here in a second, but I'm going to tease this and we'll pick it up in the podcast bonus segment. But
Okay.
this whole concept of alternative data, which
Uh-huh.
now is everywhere, and data brokers are buying it and selling it all over the place. And
Mhm.
I've done some pretty good research on this, and I realized that there are several companies I've talked to I know that are capturing pretty much a lot of it is geared around what they call exhaust data from credit card companies, but it's kind of a misleading term because they will collect how much you spent at this restaurant, how much you spent at the gas station, like all the detailed transactions are actually being bought and sold to investment bankers, to other institutional investors. So what happens is that some of these folks have enough data now to get a baseline and understand consumer behavior, and they can't get cash, but they can get credit cards. I don't think they can get debit cards, but maybe some of them can. And so, point being, there are now organizations that know from the raw transactional data at scale which companies are going to meet or beat market estimates on Wall Street. Well, if you know that, then how the heck do you lose when you gamble? Because the analogy I give is, let's say there's four of us playing cards at my house, and the rule is I can see all your cards, but none of you can see my cards. Well, if I lose, I'm an idiot. I don't know the rules of gambling, apparently, because I have such an advantage now because I know what all of you have. And I know this is happening. So, my argument, I'll let you think about this as we go to the break. My thought was from a policy perspective, let's say that if if credit card company is going to sell this exhaust data to one of these brokers, they must also publish anonymized data to some consumer facing data lake that then any investor or any interested party could log into and kind of browse around and see and better understand. Because that kind of information is very valuable. If I run some kind of retail operation and I can see at some scale which products are selling, which products aren't selling, what's happening in this region, what's happening in that region. That helps me do a better job of buying things that I know my customers will probably want without revealing too much about where the data came from. But at least it's useful. And what I'm really angling at is a way of leveling the playing field between these insiders. And I even came up with a term for it. I call it outsider trading, right? So insider trading, everyone understands that. Outsider trading is where from the outside, I've been able to gather so much information that I know exactly what's going to happen next. But we'll pick that up after the break in 1 second. We'll be right back. All right, folks, we're back here with Chris Mohr from SIIA. I just threw a curveball question at him there. I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts about all this alternative data stuff and policies we can define that are reasonable that will level the playing field?
So a couple of things there. I mean, one is I hear that word in a bunch of different that phrase rather in a bunch of different contexts. And I think we're talking about, so I'm sure we're talking about the same thing. What you're talking about is kind of information that's available that's outside of sort of the four corners of required reporting. So
Right.
that could be everything from, as you say, credit company exhaust, credit card exhaust data to social media trend data.
Mm-hmm.
And so when this data is, I think the way the rules are now, This information is scrubbed so that there's no material non-public information in it. So there was a company called App Annie that got into a bit of hurt with the FTC, with the SEC, because it wasn't taking that stuff out.
Hmm.
And lo and behold, like you can imagine, their results, right, were pretty good. Um, but that's not that's not what the business is. What it is finding information from these different sources. Each of these firms has their own way of balancing and analyzing it, and then providing, as you said, recommendations, trading recommendations to, or data from which trades could be made to,
Right. Right.
right, to
That's right.
to different types of investors. Uh, there is at the moment, I mean, I think I would hesitate to mandate competition in that space. I would be intuitively, I mean, intuitively, I think, the business is, I think, growing. So in
Hmm.
other words,
Interesting.
the initially it started, okay, we're getting this information. As you said, I mean, a lot of this comes out of what you said. Like the first was like, all right, hey, we can do this. Let's do this and sell it to hedge funds, right? And then
Right.
it's like, who else would be interested in knowing all this stuff is, for example, a retailer. Nothing wrong with that either, because all of this information is de-identified. So
Right.
it's really just like it's just, okay, there were this many sales, and these are the trend lines, make your bets,
Right.
right? And I think as the business evolves, my expectation is that it's going to be that type of know-how is going to become more and more widely available, because
Hmm.
there's no reason for it not to be.
Interesting. That's a good point. Hmm. Yeah, well, we're talking about the information life cycle, right? And where it is and where you can access it and what you can do with it. I mean, open data is a big thing these days. I think that's wonderful news. There's a lot of information coming out. I was actually an advocate way back in 2005 when I worked for the Data Warehousing Institute. I got on a big soapbox and said we need transparency in federal spending. And I did this whole media campaign. I had Bacon's Media Source at my access. And so I emailed 40,000 reporters all about the need for transparency in federal spending. Everyone told me I was crazy. And then something happened. There was actually a guy at the Heritage Foundation, Mark Tapscott, who picked up on it. And he was like, "Why did you send me this?" And I was like, "Well, I went off my whole tangent." He goes, "I've been focused on this for 20 years. Like, where have you been all my life?" And he used my article, and really it was the imprimatur of the Data Warehousing Institute that he used to go testify before Congress and say we need these citizen auditors to help us find waste. And lo and behold, the House passed a bill. The Senate passed a bill co-sponsored by a guy named Barack Obama, who was a senator from Illinois. And on September 26, 2006, then President George W. Bush signed the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Law. And I almost had a heart attack when my friend called me and told me. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" No, I'm not going to say I got any credit for anything, which is fine. I don't mind, but I was just absolutely shocked. And now when you look at it, you think, and my theory back then was that, look, everybody knows something. So even though some accountant may not know that this line item looks funky, there's someone who does. There's a carpenter somewhere who knows this kind of nail should only cost 10 cents. It should not cost $1.10, or whatever the case may be. And these days we have the capacity, like the Amazon Mechanical Turk, for example, to leverage crowdsourcing at scale. And so if people register with the system, I'm a citizen. You know everything I do in the system. When I flag something, if I'm right or wrong, you can see how you could dynamically score these things and then really wind up with a whole cadre of experts preening or information systems for the government to help everyone know where the money goes. Because a lot of times, I mean, people worry about fraud. That is true. Bad things do happen. And they're just mistakes. They're just things that people overlook too. So being able to find all that stuff, I think is very, very interesting. But final thoughts from you, Chris Mohr of SIIA here on the show.
uh, like I said, I'm mostly optimistic about these technologies.
Yeah.
You know, you Do they need guardrails? Yeah, they do. They really do, because if what you're trying to do is mimic human intelligence, um, human intelligence, we put guardrails around that as well. There's certain things we're not allowed to do, and we have good reasons for doing that,
That's
right?
pretty funny. That's a good
Um,
way to put it.
but there's going to be a need for that as things develop. And what the type of thing that you are discussing is applied to the government is tremendously useful. I think there are a number of private businesses and even members who are selling all kinds of solutions that do the same thing, right? They go into your spreadsheets and they'll say, "Oh, that's weird."
Yeah. Right.
Where year over year, an employee changes one year to the other. Maybe they don't go back 5 years. Maybe they don't go
Right.
back one year,
Right.
and check to see how things have changed. And suddenly that looks odd and it gets
Yeah.
flat.
That's
And that's
right.
how banks detect fraud too,
Yeah. Well,
right?
hey,
They
this
put
has been this has
markers.
been absolutely fantastic. Chris Mohr, Mohr. Look this organization up online, SIIA, doing wonderful work. You've made me more optimistic too about the future, so it's very good to know. And they're doing great work in policy. Look them up online, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.